The wind cut through the town of Dry Creek like it wanted blood. Dust, ash, and something uglier clung to the air, a leftover stench from the fire that had burned through half the settlement last month. And standing at the edge of the crowd, coat too thin, eyes too tired, was Luke McAllister, the last rancher left on Hollow Bend Road. Watching the human auction. The makeshift platform in front of the courthouse creaked beneath the weight of boots and broken soles. Behind it, men smoked cheap cigars and sipped sour whiskey from dented flasks, jeering as each lot was brought out like livestock. They called it a public settlement, a final means of resolving debts and redistributing burdens, but everyone knew what it really was, a sale of the forgotten. Luke's jaw clenched as a woman was led out, hair matted under a sun-bleached bonnet, dragging a crying toddler behind her, sold for $8 and a promise of winter grain. He had seen worse things in the war, but this gnawed at something deeper. "Next lot," called the auctioneer, wiping sweat from his brow though the air was cold. Grace Callahan and her 5 sons. The crowd shifted. Some straightened in interest, others chuckled knowingly. Luke narrowed his eyes. Grace stepped out slowly, her shoulders square despite the tremble in her hands. Her dress, once deep blue, was faded and threadbare. Her boots didn't match. A scar sliced clean across one cheek, half faded. The oldest boy looked 13, lanky and defiant. The youngest couldn't have been more than 3, red-faced, clinging to her apron. 32. Widow of Sergeant James Callahan, 5 strong boys, house burned in the Crescent Ridge raid, all debts transferred to state possession. Opening bid, $5. Someone in the crowd whistled. "That's a full farm labor crew right there." More mouths than hands. Someone else said, "They'll last 2 weeks out there with McAllister," came another voice, low and cruel. Luke didn't blink. He looked at Grace. At the boys. The oldest one stared back with a fury Luke had only seen in men too young to carry it. His hands itched. He hadn't spoken to another soul in weeks, hadn't seen his land in full bloom in years. His fences were falling. His horses limped. And every night, he still dreamed of a fire and a grave too small for the name he'd carved. 10, he said. The auctioneer raised a brow. $10. That's the highest we've had all week. Do I hear? 12? Silence. Just the groan of the wind. Luke stepped forward. Cash. No note. "You serious, McAllister?" someone called. "They'll eat you dry." "They're not for eating," Luke replied. A few laughed. Most just watched. The gavel came down with a thud that echoed too long. Sold to Luke. "McAllister of Hollow Bend Road." Grace didn't move. Her face was blank, unreadable. She held the hands of her sons tighter. Luke approached slowly as if stepping through glass. "I got a wagon out back," he said. She nodded once, wordless. The boys followed, some silent, some crying softly. The middle one, maybe 11, stopped by Luke's boots. Spat on the toe. Luke didn't move, just stared at him. They loaded up in silence. A few townsfolk watched from the porches. Some crossed themselves, others just turned away. As Luke climbed into the wagon and flicked the reins, the sky overhead threatened snow. They caught him. Wheels creaked. The horses groaned. Thomas leaned close to his mother and whispered, "He bought us like cattle." Grace didn't flinch. Her eyes were on the road ahead. "Then we survive like wolves." The wagon groaned as it crested the hill, revealing Hollow Bend Ranch like a ghost from a forgotten life. The barn leaned westward, half its roof gone. Fences lay in twisted heaps, and the house looked like it was holding its breath not to fall over. Snow dusted everything, a thin, cruel blanket that promised a harder storm to come. Grace said nothing as they climbed down. She gathered the boys and marched them toward the porch. The steps creaked, but held. Luke unloaded their bundles, few, as they were, then handed her a rusted key. "The back door's stuck. You'll have to kick it." She didn't thank him. Just nodded, her eyes scanning the sagging shingles, the broken chimney, the wolf tracks leading down to the creek. Inside, it was worse, cold like a grave, no firewood stacked, no mattresses upstairs, just thin cots, straw poking out, and a stove that coughed when lit. Luke chopped until his hands bled, bringing in enough wood to get them through the first night, but the cold didn't care about human effort. By the third day, the youngest boy, Jonah, cried through the night. His fingers were white at the tips. Frostbite. Grace wrapped them in wool and held him close, whispering stories Luke couldn't hear. Daniel, the middle child with the sharp jaw and sharper eyes, swore under his breath and refused to wear gloves. He worked the hardest, not to please, but to prove something. Thomas, the oldest, watched everything. Quiet, measuring, judging. Luke didn't trust him, but he respected the boy's silence. It was familiar. Luke cooked. Basic stuff. Beans, cornbread, jerky boiled into soup. Grace cooked once and nearly burnt the kitchen down. She didn't try again. Luke didn't mention it. They worked like strangers forced to share a lifeboat. The boys cleared brush. Grace hauled water. Luke repaired the barn door with rusted hinges and old nails. No one smiled, but no one complained, until Daniel disappeared. It happened the morning after another fight between Grace and Luke, over chores, over breakfast, over nothing. Luke had scolded the boy too hard for tracking mud into the house. Grace had snapped, "They're not your soldiers." By dusk, Daniel was gone. A few footprints led toward the woods, then vanished under falling snow. Luke rode out without a word, just grabbed his rifle, saddled the sorrel, and followed the wind. The snow thickened, swallowing sound. He called Daniel's name once, then again. No answer. For hours he combed the ridge, searching through brush and frozen hollows. His fingers numbed, his horse stumbled. Just as he turned back, heart heavy, body frozen, he spotted a dark patch beneath a pine. Daniel was curled beneath it, his lips blue, eyes half-lidded. Luke dismounted and wrapped the boy in his coat, carried him all the way back on foot. Grace stood on the porch, lantern raised when he appeared through the storm. She ran to them sobbing, pulling Daniel into her arms. Then she turned to Luke and slapped him across the face. "This is your fault," she whispered. "You think yelling makes boys into men? You don't own them. You don't speak to them like that." Luke didn't flinch, but something cracked behind his eyes. "I didn't ask for any of you," he growled. "I just needed help." Grace's face froze. Her mouth opened, then shut. She turned and carried Daniel inside. Later, after the others were asleep, Luke sat in the kitchen, nursing, a cracked knuckle and a cup of bitter coffee. Grace entered, her eyes hollow. She poured herself a cup without asking. They sat in silence, the only sound the ticking of an old clock that hadn't told the right time in years. Grace finally said, "We didn't ask for this either. But we're here." Luke didn't answer, but he looked at her differently after that. Not softer, but clearer, like squinting through smoke. The next morning, he saddled the sorrel and rode up the ridge alone. At the crest of the hill was a little grave, a wooden cross barely standing. No name etched, just a bundle of dried lilies crumbling at the base. Luke knelt, pulled off his glove, slipped a silver band from his finger, the only thing he'd kept after the fire, and placed it at the foot of the cross. "I'm still here," he whispered. By the time he returned, the sun had broken through the clouds. That evening, something strange happened. Thomas disappeared into the woods after supper. Luke nearly shouted after him, but Grace stopped him. "Give him a minute." An hour later, Thomas came back. His boots muddy, eyes bright, a squirrel dangling from a crude snare and, stranger still, a short bow in his hand. Luke stared at the bow. "Where'd you get that?" Thomas shrugged. "Old man in a coyote skin. Didn't say much. Just watched me set the trap. Then handed me this." Luke stiffened. He scanned the tree line. Far off, past the brush, a figure stood just beyond the light. Tall, wrapped in hides, holding a carved walking stick. A Comanche scout, or what was left of one. Luke had heard the stories. Some called him Wasi, ghost hunter. Others said he'd saved more lives in silence than the whole army in command. The man nodded. Once, then vanished into the dusk. At supper, Thomas passed out bowls of stew. The meat was lean, gamey, but hot. They sat around the table in silence the way they had for days. Then Thomas looked at Luke. "Pa used to say you don't own what you don't protect." He paused, eyes flicking toward Daniel sleeping near. "The fire. Thanks for finding him." Luke didn't reply, just ladled more stew into Thomas's bowl. Outside, the snow had stopped, but inside, for the first time, the house was warm. The snow had only just begun to melt when the sheriff rode in like thunder. His horse kicked up slush and gravel, breath steaming from its nostrils like smoke from a gun barrel. Luke met him at the gate, rifle in hand, eyes already narrowed with knowing. "Luke," Sheriff Mallory said, dismounting fast. "You heard yet?" "No." "Then listen close. There's trouble coming from the south. Real kind of trouble. Ex-Confederate holdouts, raiders, not boys looking for food, men looking for flame." Luke said nothing. "They hit 3 homesteads between here and Meadow Fork, burned the last one to the ground, took what they wanted, left nothing but smoke. Behind them." Grace stood on the porch, one hand on Jonah's shoulder. The boy clung to her skirt like he already understood. Mallory lowered his voice. "Luke, they're headed north. Hollow Bend is next. You need to get that woman and those boys out of here. I'll wire the depot, arrange for rail east." Luke turned, eyes hard. "I'll think on it." "There's nothing to think on," the sheriff barked, spitting into the dirt. "They won't spare her. They sure as hell won't spare the boys." Luke didn't reply. Just watched the horizon until the sheriff mounted and rode off. That night, he told Grace. She didn't flinch, just folded laundry tighter and kept her eyes on the stitching. "You need to go," he said. "I'll cover the cost, get you to Kansas. You've got cousins there, don't you?" She looked up. "We've run too long, lost too much. This isn't pride. This is survival." She shook her head. "We survive by standing, not fleeing." "Not anymore." Luke stared at her for a long time. Then for the first time in weeks he smiled. Faint, broken, but real. "All right then." They began preparing that same hour. Luke laid out the traps, the snares, the rusted nails bent into caltrops. He took the boys into the woods and showed them where to set tripwires and how to walk without leaving a trail. Thomas listened with quiet intensity. Daniel pretended not to, but his hands were steady when he reset a bear trap with one hard stomp. Even Jonah carried firewood now without complaint. Wasi returned like a shadow, stepping out of the trees near dusk, face painted in soot and ash, hair braided with bone. This time he spoke. "They will come at night." Luke nodded. "How many?" 5. Maybe 6. One carries a torch. One carries nothing. He is the worst. "Why help us?" Wasi's eyes flicked toward the children. "Because they still remember how to fight with fear, not hatred." He placed a bundle of arrows at Luke's feet. "You will bleed, but not fall." Thomas came to Luke that night, wordless, and held out his hand. Luke opened the old chest by his bed. Inside was a pistol, dull, heavy, with a grip worn smooth by time and grief. "You ever fired one?" Thomas shook his head. "Not yet." Luke placed the gun in his palm. "Don't fire unless you mean it, and if you do, don't miss." Elsewhere, Daniel hammered boards over the barn windows by himself, nailing them straight and tight. Grace stood watching, eyes glassy. "Where'd you learn that?" she asked. Daniel shrugged. "Been watching him." Wasi strung a bow on the porch. Grace passed him coffee. He drank without thanks. As the sun dipped, Luke sharpened a knife, watching the trees. "They'll come from the ridgeline," he said. "When the moon rises." He was right. The raiders came just past midnight, horses cloaked in mud and cloth, riders silent as ghosts. One threw a torch before anyone could shout. It landed short, sputtering in the snow. Then hell opened. Luke fired first, a shot clean through the leader's shoulder. Wasi's arrows rained from the dark, fast and whispering. Daniel tripped a snare and sent a rider tumbling into a pit lined with spikes. The barn caught fire anyway. A second torch hurled into its side like a warning. Luke raced to it, coat over his head, kicking flames aside. That's when he saw Jonah crawling toward the chickens, crying. "No!" Luke bellowed. He dove, pulling the boy free just as the roof caved in. A beam smashed across Luke's back, not crushing, but bad enough. He crawled the last few feet, clutching Jonah to his chest. Across the field, Thomas shouted. A raider had grabbed him, tried to drag him toward the tree line. Grace screamed. She fumbled with a rifle, pulled the trigger. Nothing. Jerked the bolt again. Bang! The raider dropped like dead weight. Grace stood trembling, smoke rising from the barrel, her breath hitching in her chest like it couldn't find air. Luke stumbled toward her, blood seeping from his coat, eyes wide with pain. She caught him as he fell. By dawn, the raiders were gone, dead or scattered. The barn was half gone, but the house stood. The family stood. Luke lay on the bed, pale, breathing shallow. Thomas sat beside him. Neither spoke at first. Then Thomas said almost a whisper, "You ain't my pa." Luke didn't move, but if I had a say, you'd be close. Silence again. Luke's throat worked hard to find the words. Finally, hoarse, he whispered, "I'll take that, son." And that was enough. The wind changed with the season. Where snow once blanketed Hollow Bend, wild grass now pushed up defiantly through ash and churned soil. The barn's blackened ribs had been rebuilt by 6 hands and stubborn will. The fence still bore charred posts, but green shoots crawled up their bases like they meant to stay. Luke rose each morning before the sun, joints aching, but heart less heavy. He'd find Thomas already up, feeding the hens. Daniel followed behind with a bucket, always grumbling, but never quitting. Grace had planted seedlings near the porch, green beans, squash, even tomatoes if the frost spared them. Jonah tried to water them but mostly soaked his boots. She laughed and let him. They were still poor, still scraping by, but there was peace in the struggle now, like the land itself had chosen not to fight them anymore. Some nights, Luke and Grace sat on the porch as the stars blinked over the plains. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Once she passed him a cup of coffee and said, "You breathe easier now." He didn't answer, but the way he looked at her, just looked for a long time, was answer enough. Wasi disappeared one morning without a sound. No note, no trail, only a small carving left on the windowsill, a wolf low to the ground, its eyes carved sharp, as if it was watching even now. Thomas found it, held it for a while, said nothing, but his hands curled around it like it mattered more. Then he'd admit. Then the sheriff came again. This time not with warnings, but with papers and opportunity. "Town's reorganizing," he said. "Need someone steady for Hollow Bend. The rest want to make you part of the council." Luke scoffed. "Since when do they want me?" "Since you kept the fire off their backs. You've earned respect, whether you like it or not." Luke didn't. Answer. Mallory hesitated, then handed him another paper. "Government's offering a stipend," he said. "If you sign this, you'd be the legal guardian of the Callahan boys. Grace, too, if you're ready." Luke's face went still. His thumb brushed the edge of the page, reading names written in someone else's ink. Thomas Callahan, Daniel, Jonah. He looked out toward the barn. Daniel and Thomas were tossing feed at each other, pretending it was a fight. Jonah clung to the pup Grace had let him keep, a wild-eyed mutt that barked at its own tail. Luke swallowed. His hand didn't move. That night he sat by the fire, staring at the hearth like it held the answer. He remembered Thomas spitting at his boots. He remembered Grace, fists clenched, saying, "We survive like wolves." He remembered Daniel crying in the snow, then later hammering boards with calloused hands. He remembered the pistol in Thomas's shaking grip, the raiders bleeding in the frost, Grace's scream and the shot that saved her son. He remembered laughter. Not loud, not constant, but real. The kind that lived between chores, between bruises, between moments too fragile to name. He remembered quiet. He remembered the silence after his wife died, and the silence now, which no longer echoed. The next morning, Luke rode into Dry Creek, the Courthouse was small, whitewashed, leaning west like it had somewhere to be. Luke stepped inside, straight-backed, hat in hand. They handed him a pen. He stared at it for a moment. Then he signed. No one clapped. No one said thank you. But when he walked out, he was lighter. The next Sunday, the church held a picnic. A long table was set out with biscuits, smoked ham, corn fritters. Children chased each other through the grass. Laughter bloomed under the sky. Grace sat under the awning, holding the baby of another settler while its mother rested. She looked younger than she had that first day on the auction block. Or maybe not younger, just unburdened. Thomas helped a younger boy learn how to whittle without slicing his thumb. Daniel held a fishing rod, trying to teach Jonah how to cast. Jonah was more interested in throwing rocks. Luke stood near the edge of the group, arms crossed, until Jonah came running. He reached up. "Pa! Up!" Luke blinked, then crouched and lifted him high to his shoulders. The boy squealed with delight. A neighbor passed by, chewing on a toothpick. Nodded. "Didn't think you'd make a family out of nothing, McAllister." Luke grinned, slow and cracked but warm. "Wasn't nothing," he said. "Just needed time to see what it was." The wind carried that moment out across the plains, quiet and certain, like roots finding dirt after the fire's gone. As the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the fields, Luke stood watching the boys laugh. Grace smiled. The wolf carving still sat in his coat pocket, heavy in a good way. The prairie rustled. But the wolves weren't circling anymore. They were home. If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes in second chances and the strength of found family. Hit that like button, subscribe for more Frontier Tales, and leave a comment. Who was your favorite character in this story? Until next time, keep your fire burning, even when the world turns cold.